scary stories. This happened years ago, but still affects me to this day. The summer after I graduated high school, I was still living at home. I was up late one night and was packing for a camping trip with my friends. It was unbelievably hot and had the window open as I sat and folded clothes. It was around 2 in the morning, and the next thing I knew, there was a hand coming through the gap in the screen of my window. I screamed, and the hand flew back. I was stunned, but there was a part of me that wondered if it was my younger brother pranking me. I got up and looked out the window and just saw the figure of a man staring back at me. I ran into my brother's room, and he was there playing video games. We called the police, who came and searched the area. They found nothing, warned me and my parents to lock the windows and doors, and left. We were all still shaken up, and my mom had a feeling that he would come back. It turns out our mother's intuition was right. She went outside and waited on our back porch. After 20 minutes or so, she saw a man, dressed in black, slink into the backyard along the tree line. He hid behind a tree for a few seconds and ran to the other tree and hid there, slowly working his way toward my window. My mother yelled something to him, and he took off running. The police came back out, and again, found no trace of him. I opened the window again, not even the curtains. My parents installed some motion detecting lights, and that seemed to be the end of that. About 6 months later, my friend and I got an apartment downtown together. We were really excited. This was our first place on our own. The apartment wasn't exactly the best quality, but it was so fun to be living in the city. The downside was that it was street parking only. After a few weeks, my car was broken into. Nothing was taken but a single rose sat on the passenger seat. It was creepy, but I vowed to be vigilant and safe. I always tried to park close to the entrance, near the lights. But often it was difficult to get those spots, and I would often have to park further away on darker streets. Things quickly began escalating at this point. My car was broken into at least once a week. Most of the time, a flower was left, but once a pair of men's underwear was left. And even more creepily, once a bag of Tootsie Rolls, as they were my favorite candy. This made me wonder if the person knew me personally, and I started to become suspicious of everyone. There was laundry in the basement of the apartment, and one day I went down to get a load that finished drying. As I started to fold, I realized all of my undergarments, bras, and panties were gone. Another week, and I had a male friend over from high school, and his tires got slashed during the visit. By the time the first letter arrived, I had already started making plans to move elsewhere. The letter described a love for me that had been going on for years. He noted things that proved he had been watching me closely. I was able to arrange for another friend to take over my lease and moved in with another friend on the other side of the city. It was a secure building and had an underground parking garage that was only accessible to tenants. I felt much more secure, and the extra money spent was well worth the peace of mind. Things were quiet for a few months, and then my roommate got a boyfriend. Most of us were weary of Ashley's new boyfriend from the beginning. For one, they met on MySpace after he reached out to her, Another reason was that new boyfriend, Matt, was extremely good looking. And while Ashley was a wonderful person, she just wasn't the type. She just wasn't the type you would typically expect someone like him to date. Ashley was thrilled. She had never had a boyfriend and really felt like he was a Prince Charming. I thought he was weird and creepy from the beginning. Matt was on the quiet side and always seemed to be sporting an uncomfortable, lingering smile. It was difficult to carry on any sort of conversation with him because he would always make it weird with some random facts that were completely unrelated to what we were talking about. I had deleted my MySpace when the initial stalking began, but I created the dummy account to learn more about Matt. It didn't look like he really knew any of his friends in real life. There was only pictures of himself, and the rest of the information was vague. My friends and I gently tried to discourage her from seeing Matt. He technically hadn't done anything wrong, but he was just so strange. She would immediately get defensive and would shut the conversation down. Matt started to spend more time at the apartment, and I found myself finding any excuse I could to avoid coming home. One day, I came home from work and found Matt on my couch alone, drinking a beer. Ashley had been called into work, and she told him he could just hang out. I was furious because I didn't want to spend any time with him, so I grabbed a beer and a snack and headed off to my room and shut the door. About 30 minutes or so, he knocked on my door and suggested we watch some TV and get to know each other better because we both loved Ashley. I didn't want to, but decided that maybe I needed to give it a try. He put on a movie, and I tried to just focus on the movie because I didn't want to talk. At one point, I glanced over to Matt, and he was staring at me with a smile on his face. I snapped a "what" at him, and he just continued smiling and said, "I just can't believe it." "Believe what?" I asked. He said nothing and went back to watching the movie, still smiling. I had no idea what he was talking about, but the interaction had every hair standing up on my body. I excused myself and locked the door to my room. Another month or so went on, and I had managed to avoid being home for much anything beyond sleep and showering. Matt practically lived there and had even brought a bunch of his things to Ashley's room. I really didn't want to move again, but was beginning to look for other options. On their 6-month anniversary, I saw a huge banquet of flowers on the table, and an already opened card popped up next to it. I rolled my eyes and was about to leave when I decided to see what the weirdo wrote to her. When I opened the card, my heart started beating through my chest. The handwriting was exactly the same as the one my stalker had sent. I kept them as evidence and dug them out of my desk for comparison. The handwriting was unique and identical. Matt was the stalker. I called the police first. As they were on their way, I called Ashley and asked her to come over. She was at work, but said she would be there when she could. I was terrified to tell her because I knew she would be shattered. The police took a statement from me and actually went to Ashley's work to get more information from her, and they ended up breaking the news. Apparently, Ashley called Matt and left a furious message, even though the cops told her not to say anything, and he completely disappeared after that. There was no Matt or anyone matching his resemblance at the place he said he worked. Ashley had never been to his apartment because he said he had been staying with friends while trying to save money for a trip to Europe. His family lived out of state, she had never met a friend of his because he said they had a falling out because he was choosing to spend so much time with Ashley. It was all lies, and in the end, she was dating a stranger. We don't even know if Matt was his real name. The cherry on top of all this whole thing was when we went through Matt's things. He had left everything when we disappeared, and Ashley and I decided to go through everything. There was a duffel bag that was full of gym clothes, but in one of the compartments, there were about 10 pictures of me. All of them were taken from far away, with the exception of one of me sleeping. The sheets were current, so I know it had to have been at the current apartment. Before I started locking my bedroom door, a few pictures dated back to before the incident at my parents' house, which made us think that was him as well. 2 pairs of my missing underwear were there, and I shuddered to think what he did with the rest. A Starbucks lid with my red lipstick marks, a necklace I hadn't even noticed missing, a few other random sick souvenirs. The police never tracked him down. I decided to accept an opportunity overseas that I hadn't been considering and got the hell out of there. Unfortunately, Ashley and I quickly drifted apart. She had a really hard time accepting that her first love was a complete psycho. I think I had some underlying anger for believing all of his lies and letting him into our lives. I don't know what his end game was. Would he have tried to hurt me? Or was he simply content with being in my world? I'll never know. Being stalked changes you. Even when I lived across the world, I looked over my shoulder everywhere I went. I still have no social media accounts attached to my real name. I am married with children and know that he moved on to torment some other poor woman. But every time I visit my hometown, I am tense and keep a low profile. Part of me will always worry that Matt will resurface again. Before any judgment is placed, I would like to say I wasn't in the best state of mind prior nor during the situation. I had just gone through a difficult breakup, a suicide attempt, moved back in with my parents, then experienced a sexual assault by a trusted friend. I didn't have a good judge of character. I was by far hitting my rock bottom. After several months at my mother's house, after the sexual assault, I realized I desperately needed to get out of that atmosphere and try to get back on my feet. I found a cheap home for rent and began my life all over again. It wasn't the nicest place, certainly not as warm and comforting as my last place, but it would do temporarily. Shortly after moving in, still not in the right mindset, with a huge lack of self-care, I began using almost anything I could get my hands on. Many psychedelics, acid, mushrooms, and MDMA. Anyone who has experienced MDMA can tell you it gives you this incredible sense of happiness and content, which at the same time I had neither. These short-term bouts of false happiness sucked any remaining amount of serotonin from my brain, left me feeling just, if not more, empty inside. On top of that, after my suicide attempt, I was abruptly taking off all of my medications as I used them to hurt myself prior. This meant my sleeping medication, and with it, trickled down that familiar insomnia. Then I was taken off of my SSRI, which, when stopping abruptly, can exceedingly send you into a state of manic depression and confusion. At last, but not least, I was taken off of my anxiety medication. I relied on this for years. took me out of my agoraphobia and helped me with my PTSD triggers, which having my attacker live just several blocks away on the very same street as another individual whom abused me from ages 11 until 14, I simply lost all abilities to cope. After some time of intense withdrawals from my anxiety medication and even experiencing a seizure, I began to buy pills. The only ones available to me were Xanax, which I quickly developed a tolerance to, and at my worst I was taking anywhere from 12 to 20 milligrams a day. Because of the Xanax abuse, there were many things I didn't completely recall, such as my wedding to a bass-playing musician I had only known a month, as well as much of the month we spent together. My most vivid memories were lying on the couch, watching The Office on Netflix, religiously shaking and sweating in between buys and re-ups from my pill dealer. I began drinking heavily and hanging out in the wrong crowd, the grunge punk crowd, the ones that couch surfed much of their lives, destroyed things in their path, didn't work, and calmly used others, burning each individual bridge as they passed. As I was in no state to actually care, I enjoyed their company, and one individual in particular I'll refer to as Sideshow Bob started to become what I thought was my best friend, even wearing a dress at my wedding as my maid of honor. He often wore women's clothes, not because he was transgender, but because he simply liked to. Some made fun of him for this, but I thought it was cool that he didn't care what others thought. He really seemed to have a kind of goofy nature about him that I admired. But as a man that wore women's clothes, he'd often get into my closet. I'd like to add that Bob had very poor hygiene. He wore no deodorant, he showered rarely, and his feet, those feet left a smell permanently absorbed into the carpet fibers that stayed, even when I moved out. He would often hop off of the couch around 4 p.m. or so and rush to his pizza delivery job. He never stopped to shower or even brush his teeth. He'd even wake up and throw back on the same uniform he had been wearing for weeks, which stunk of cheap weed, pizza grease, and feet. On New Year's Eve, 2016, I left at the time my husband, after a serious withdrawal, and being around him completely sober, it became obvious he was using methamphetamine. I was suspicious of it before, as I used to use it when I was younger, along with nearly half of all of my family members. You can always sense it. He knew before marrying me that this was the big no for me. My brother in prison, my father's heart attack and death, all contributed to methamphetamine use. He knew this when he married me, yet he kept it a secret. I do blame myself partly for this. It's the kind of thing that occurs when you marry a stranger. About a year later, he passed away from a shot laced with fentanyl. They found his body 5 days later. After the separation from my husband, I allowed Bob to stay. He didn't have a room. He slept on the couch. He didn't contribute to groceries or bills, and quite frankly turned my home into a disgusting mess. But since my OCD seemed to have dissolved into my drinking, and I preferred not being alone with my thoughts, I didn't really mind. Within a week of leaving my husband, Bob grew increasingly more obsessed with the thought of us being together. I made it very clear I had no intentions with him and valued our friendship. Not to mention, I was about to experience my first divorce and all the shame that came along with it. I started avoiding the home. I started avoiding him. Every time I'd return to the home, he'd be there, in tears. Some days I'd find him not only in my clothes, but in my bed. Eventually, he quit his job to have a better chance of seeing me. He'd follow me room to room, demanding to know why it is that he can't see us together. Eventually, I told him if it didn't stop, he needed to leave. But he was quick to tell me that legally he was a tenant in my home and he needed 30 days' notice. I'm not going anywhere, you fucking bitch. Things grew more aggressive, and I grew more uncomfortable and afraid by the days. His tears turned to anger, his questions turned to screaming. One very vivid memory I have is him staring me directly in my eyes, red-faced, spit flying, screaming, "I'm sick of being fucking rejected by women." He was no longer my goofy drinking buddy. He was someone I absolutely could not be around. A police officer suggested I get a restraining order to get him off of my premise, which I did. Then I kept the doors locked. His only few possessions in my home were a guitar and an amp, which I placed on the back porch, then notified him. He immediately tried to break into the house, kicking the old front door with such force I could see it begin to crack at the deadbolt, leaving dark shoe prints on the cracked white paint. Police had trouble serving him. He quit his job. He had no actual address, although I provided them with his car description, license plate, and friends' addresses. Morning, noon, and night, I'd find myself crying, pressed up against the door, hoping it wouldn't break open. Every time I called the police, he had already left. I'd find myself up at night, staring out the window, watching that loud green car of his drive by, feeling my pulse rise, phone in hand. For weeks I received surprise visits from him. Most were terrifying. Occasionally some were thought out. One evening he had a mutual friend knock on the door, which I happily opened, only for him to quickly jump out from behind the door and attempt entering. I moved as swiftly and as strongly as I could to slam the door and lock it. After a few months, he moved on. He found a girlfriend who kicked him out quite quickly. He responded by beating her unconscious and attempting to cut her throat. Luckily, a neighbor heard the commotion and Bob quickly ran. He got off easy on those charges. But of course, if you Google his name, you see the repeated charges of serious assault. I let a friend stay with me and crash on my couch until he became obsessed with the thought of us being together. He began sleeping in my bed when I wasn't home, wore my clothes. If I came home, he'd cry and follow me, then eventually turned into him screaming and cornering me. I got a restraining order against him, but the police could never find him to serve him. Despite showing it to him, he still repeatedly tried to break into my house for over a month. Some time later, he got a girlfriend and beat her unconscious and attempted to cut her throat. I moved an hour and a half away from that town, but I will be returning at the end of this month. Back when I was a kid, my mom and I had a deal. She'd schedule all my scarier appointments, like dentist visits and vaccines, in the morning, and if I went without whining or fussing too much, I'd get to play hooky for the rest of the school day, and we'd get lunch, go to the mall, and see a movie. This was one of those days. It was a few weeks before Christmas, but the mall was pretty much quiet because it was around 1 p.m. on a weekend. I'd had my picture taken with Santa. We did some Christmas shopping and had lunch at my favorite restaurant, and we were going to finish off our day with whatever kid's Christmas movie was playing at the time. I don't remember which one it was, but I remember how fun and pleasant the day had been. The theater was pretty much almost empty. Just my mom and I, and a few parents with kids too young to be in school. A few minutes later, a single man walked in. I remember him entering because I thought it was weird that he didn't have any kids with him, and because he seemed to spend a long time surveying the theater, the way people do when they are trying to find a seat or two in a crowded auditorium. I remember him staring at me for quite a while, but then he sat down near the door, and I didn't think too much about it. A girl I played with in my neighborhood had really strict parents, and they always went to see kids' movies alone first to be sure they approved of them. Maybe his kids went to school with me, and he recognized me, and that was why his eyes had lingered. Just as the previews had started, I realized I needed to pee. I had just turned 8 years old a few months earlier, and my mom was finally letting me do things like that without her accompanying me. As I got up to go, my mom slipped me $10 and told me to get some candy and soda, a real treat in my house. I was so excited to be trusted to go by myself and to get candy that I almost didn't notice when the man from earlier got up and followed closely behind me as I left the theater. Almost as I was allowed to do things myself more, my parents had drilled into me that I always needed to be aware of my surroundings and anything that felt off. And the way he bolted from his seat to follow me out of the theater felt off. To give a little context, the movie theater was attached to the mall, so the main entrance was through the mall itself. To make getting out a little easier, there were a few exit-only doors that led to the parking lot. The restrooms were right next to these. The man followed me all the way to the women's bathroom, not close enough to immediately spook me if I hadn't noticed him, but close enough that any passerby would assume he was a father trailing behind his daughter. After I got to the restroom, I peeked out. He'd stationed himself just outside the entrance to the bathroom on the side closest to the exit. I told myself that maybe he needed to use the bathroom too, but clearly he didn't. So I peed, and then I waited and waited. I heard a man's voice just outside joke with someone about how he was waiting for his daughter. I knew my mom wouldn't get worried and come look for me immediately because she would assume I was in line to get snacks, but I couldn't get back to her without going past the man. Finally, a nice-looking older woman came in. As she was leaving, I told her I'd forgotten how to get back to the theater where my mom was waiting, and could she walk me there. I held her hand tightly as she carefully told me she was glad to help. As we left, the man waiting took a quick step forward, like he had been waiting to grab me. When he saw that I was with the woman, he turned around and left out the exit door. I made it back to my mom without incident. I told her I didn't see any candy that I wanted, and I was kind of full from lunch anyway. In hindsight, I should have told her right away about the creepy guy who followed me, but I was afraid that I'd lose my precious new independence. But looking back as an adult, I still can't figure out any benign intentions that would explain his actions, and I desperately hope that he didn't catch some other little girl unaware. To give a little background information, this started in the winter of 2012. I was 23 years old at the time and living with my dad. My mom and my brother were living in another house about 10 minutes away from us. One morning I woke up around 8 a.m. because I had an early doctor's appointment, and I went outside to see a note pinned to the windshield wiper of our car. The note said, "I'm going to kill you, scum." I kinda laughed it off. I assumed the note was from my dad, who had a habit of complaining to parents in our neighborhood about their children's shitty behavior. There were these twin boys who liked to try and catch and torture squirrels. He often marched them home by their ears to complain about them to their parents. I thought one of the parents was just being a douchebag, so my dad and I didn't bother with it too much. Later in the day, while talking to my mom on the phone, I mentioned the note to her half-heartedly in a casual way, and I was shocked by her response. She responded by emphatically warning me several times to make sure all of my windows and doors were locked, and to bring a weapon to bed with me at night. I was a bit taken aback because she'd never said anything to me like that before. She'd never even given me the good touch, bad touch talk. She reminded me at least 12 times over the course of the conversation to bring a knife or a baseball bat to bed with me, and to lock my bedroom door at night. I thought she was just overreacting, so I waved her off. Then, other weird things started happening. We started getting random packages and deliveries sent to our house. Bibles and Qurans, newspapers, porn flyers, pizzas, and moving trucks that we hadn't ordered. The first few times it happened, I thought it was a mistake, but as it kept happening, I came to the conclusion that somebody must be pulling a prank on us. We didn't know who it was, so there was nothing we could really do about it, but apologizing profusely to yet another confused pizza delivery man. In September of that year, I started taking a night school class with my best friend. The course went from 6 p.m. to 10 p.m. every Monday and Wednesday night, and after the class, his mom would pick us up and drive us home. Sometime in November, his mom dropped me off from school, and I went inside and chilled on the couch for a couple of hours. I like to wind down before I go to bed a bit, or I can't sleep. I ended up falling asleep on the couch. Something woke me up abruptly at about 4 a.m. in the morning. I heard the unmistakable sound of a car tire being slashed, and it sounded like our car. What the hell is going on? We didn't have any enemies. In retrospect, this was probably a stupid thing to do, especially considering I'm a relatively small female. I'm only 5'5", and I was 23 at the time, but I grabbed a generic kitchen knife and went outside to check it out. When I got outside, I discovered immediately that I was correct. There was a man in our driveway slashing our car tires. Unwisely, I admittedly yelled, "Hey, you!" and he turned around to face me. That was when I noticed what he was slashing our tires with, an enormous hunting knife, at least 6 inches long. He looked surprised, but then defiant, and began to advance towards me with the knife slightly raised. I just froze. I didn't know what to do. He was coming at me so fast I couldn't even think. Thankfully, at that exact moment, my across-the-street neighbor, who had also heard him slashing our tires, turned on his porch light and yelled out the window, "Hey, I'm calling the cops." The man yelled back, "I don't give a fuck. Call them then." But he quickly retreated back to his car, where I could see a middle-aged woman with long brown hair waiting for him on the passenger seat. Our eyes locked, and I knew instantly that we had met before, but I couldn't quite put my finger on where or when. I just knew in my gut that I had met this woman before. They sped off into the night, and we called the cops, who said they couldn't do anything for us because they didn't know who had done it. I mean, isn't that the kind of your job, though, to find out who did it? Herp-a-derp. I called my mom to tell her what happened and to ask her if she had any idea who would have done this to us. She immediately said no, but there was something in her voice. I could just tell that she wasn't being honest. A few weeks later, I decided to go to my mom's house to spend a day or two there, determined to get some answers. As soon as I walked in the front door, I knew something was wrong. The second she saw me, she just started bawling her eyes out. She took me by the hand and sat me on the couch and explained the whole story to me, start to finish. It's necessary for me to give a little background information here. My mom is a businesswoman by trade. She was still in sales at the time, but she's also a bit of a hippy-dippy. Astrology and pot and reincarnation and Mercury is retrograding, so don't get into any arguments this week type of person. A couple of months ago, before this all started, she had ended up being referred a new client named Adrian by her weed dealer. Yes, my mom smokes weed. This is Canada. Everyone smokes here. Adrian was her dealer's girlfriend, and she was interested in buying Arbonne, so my mom invited her over to her apartment to look at some makeup samples. They started chatting a bit about a variety of topics, and my mom let it slip that her last name was Hayes. As my mom told me, Adrian had paused for a few seconds, looked at her, and then said, "Hayes? Did you used to be married to a man named Darian Hayes?" My mom answered that yes, Darian Hayes, my father, was her ex-husband. Then, shockingly, this Adrian woman had actually burst into tears, threw her arms around my mom in a hug, and began to tell her this horrific story about all the disgusting things that my dad had done to her. Apparently, she was 14 years old. She was now in her mid-30s. I would have been about 4 years old at the time. This would have happened around 1994. She had been dating a man named Andrew, who happened to be living with my dad at the time after my parents' divorce. According to Adrian, these men, her boyfriend Andrew, Andrew's twin brother Daniel, and my father, had taken turns beating her, sexually assaulting her, and then forcing her into prostitution in order to make money off of her. Eventually, they ended up selling her into child prostitution, from which she said she never recovered. At this point, I realized that this is where I'd recognized her from. My dad had been roommates with her boyfriend Andrew, and I used to see all three of them when I went over there to visit him every second weekend. I sobbed inconsolably during the whole retelling of this story, telling my mother how after this traumatic experience she had turned to drugs and alcohol to numb the pain of her abuse, and that she had been addicted to crack and alcohol off and on ever since because of what my father had done to her. My mom was shocked. She didn't know what to do. On the one hand, she knew my father to be a generous, soft-spoken, and kind person who had never lifted a finger to her or any other person, and who rarely raised his voice. But on the other hand, it seemed odd that Adrian would just happen to remember his name all these years later. If she had been lying, she didn't know who to believe. After several hours of crying and much consoling on my mother's part, Adrian finally left, and that was when the stalking began. A few days after this encounter, my mother came home from work to find Adrian's boyfriend sitting on her couch waiting for her. He immediately told her that he was planning on killing my father, and that my father deserved to die because he was a pedophile piece of shit, and that if my mom told anybody at all, especially the cops, that he would be sure to kill me as well. He then concluded his threat by describing the layout of our living room and exactly what outfit I was wearing that day. From then on, he and/or Adrian would text or call her several times a day to threaten and taunt her, telling her that they were going to call the cops on my dad and have him thrown in prison, that they were going to have him killed, and that if she told anybody, they would hire somebody to rape and murder me. Naturally, my mother was absolutely terrified. She was from an upper-middle-class family who had immigrated to Canada from Germany. She had never dealt with this type of person before. She stopped eating, she couldn't sleep, and she even stopped going to work. She lost 30 pounds, and her hair started to fall out from stress. She started having panic attacks because she didn't know what to do. Later, she told me that she understood how I felt because I have an anxiety disorder that causes me to experience panic attacks. Eventually, after the night when I almost got stabbed, she decided that she had to call the cops. She couldn't take the chance that they would hurt me. She had to do something about it, and what she found out was shocking. Adrian was also known to the police. When my mom told them the story, he was so well known that they weren't even surprised to hear her story. In fact, they told her Adrian had done this exact same thing at least to a dozen other men. She would meet and blackmail men into giving her money, electronics, drugs, etc., threatening to call the cops and report them for rape if they did not. Her boyfriend, who was a dealer of other drugs other than just weed, as it turned out, would often use his drug connections to intimidate and extort the men, and for some reason, he never questioned her stories of being raped, abused, and enslaved by all of the other different types of men. Adrian was a crack and heroin addict and a prostitute who would get arrested on possession and drug distribution charges. She would attempt to make deals with the police by offering them information about men who were pedophiles in exchange for less time in prison. She eventually did this so many times that the police stopped believing in her. After my mom called the cops, the whole story came undone, and Adrian and her boyfriend, thankfully, haven't bothered us since. But it's been over a year since the whole thing happened, and I'm still terrified to leave the curtains open at nighttime in case somebody is watching me. I don't think I'll ever be able to feel fully safe in this house ever again. So, Adrian, let's not meet again, ever.